Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail not for battle, not for glory, and certainly not for pillaging, but for something a little less celebrated. You're stepping aboard a creaking Viking longship tucked under scratchy wool blankets, somewhere off the fjords, surrounded by the quiet snore of shipmates. And as the salty breeze nips your nose, you start to wonder, did anyone hear? Floss. Tonight's journey isn't about axes or gods or golden chalices. It's about plaque. More specifically, the oddly soothing, slightly questionable world of Viking tooth care. Yes, that was a thing. Because for all their looting and long-distance rowing, the Norse had teeth. And teeth need looking after, even if your main diet is mead mystery stew and the occasional unfortunate fish. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes with a Viking toothbrush, assuming it wasn't just to stick a jawbone or gulp a borrowed raven feather. But we'll get to that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always amazed by how global this sleepy little voyage has become. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a damp forest clearing in the year 840 AD, boots caked in mud, the sky a never-ending swirl of gray. You're following the call of a distant horn. Your ship is almost ready to launch. But before that, someone's pulled you aside. Not to bless your voyage or hand you a war amulet. No, they want to show you their teeth. They grin wide-yellowed but strong, 2 front teeth scratched with horizontal lines. Decorative grooves, filed purposefully. For the gods, he says, or maybe for intimidation. You nod. You try not to look surprised. You also try not to flinch when he eats a dried herring like it's a soft grape. Welcome to the world of Viking dentistry, where aesthetics were optional and function was, well, mostly pain management. Contrary to the barbaric stereotype of dirty, unwashed raiders, Viking hygiene was actually somewhat advanced, at least by early medieval standards. They bathed regularly. Once a week was often back then, styled their hair with bone combs, and yes, kept grooming tools close. Archaeologists have found toothpicks made of metal bone and even bird quill. Small, ornate, and often carried on a leather thong around the neck because you never know when you'll need a quick pick before battle. Still brushing. Not really a thing. At least not in the Colgate sense. More like chewing on twigs until they frayed into bristles and rubbing them across your teeth with varying degrees of success. You might even use the fibrous root of a certain plant. Historians still argue whether Vikings preferred birch twigs or yarrow stalks. But either way, toothpaste wasn't in the picture. Nor was mint. And let's not forget their food, acidic, hard, and stubbornly chewy. Viking diets were heavy on dried meats, hard bread, and unfiltered mead, great for calorie count, terrible for enamel. Not to mention the lack of cutlery. Many people simply bit into meat straight off the bone. Efficient, absolutely. Gentle on gums. Not exactly. Now imagine falling asleep next to someone who spent the day rowing, shouting, and gnawing on smoked reindeer, all without a toothbrush in sight. That's not just historical realism, it's olfactory trauma. But here's the twist: most Viking skeletons show surprisingly good teeth. Fewer cavities than their medieval descendants, likely because they didn't have refined sugar. No pastries, no soda, no sweetened tea, just the occasional honey treat, usually reserved for the rich or ritual. One archaeological study on Norse burials in Sweden found minimal decay in adult teeth, though wear and tear was high. Think ground-down molars, chipped enamel, and the occasional tooth abscess. And yet, less rot than expected. So how did they manage? Was it genetics, diet bark-based gum? Possibly all of the above. But there's another theory: they simply lived with the pain. A sore tooth wasn't a dental emergency. It was part of the journey. And if it got really bad, someone would yank it out, usually without warning, or anesthetic. Still, it's oddly comforting to know that somewhere in a fjord village, a Viking once sat under the stars, rubbing a fishbone toothpick between their molars, dreaming not of conquest, but maybe of a night without toothache. And you nestled now in your own blanket with modern comforts and clean sheets can drift off knowing things could be worse. You could be the guy with the decorative grooves chewing tree bark with half a molar and a battle to fight at dawn. You step off the longship and into the bustling market of a Viking settlement, the scent of smoked meat and sea water mixing in the air. Somewhere to your left, someone is loudly bartering for dried cod. To your right, a man cracks open a horn of mead and takes a long, satisfied swig. It dribbles down his beard and over his teeth that are, if you're being honest, not looking great. Yellowed, chipped, and almost certainly scented with centuries of fermented honey. Mead, the Viking beverage of choice. Sweet, sticky, fermented honey wine. Delicious, yes. Enamel-friendly, not at all. You watch as another man chomps into a strip of dried seal meat, like it's beef jerky, grinding it with flat molars worn down from a lifetime of abrasive food. Historians still debate how much of the Viking dental wear came from actual eating versus grit, tiny bits of sand and stone from unfiltered grain that snuck into their bread and wore down teeth like natural sandpaper. Imagine biting into your breakfast and unknowingly exfoliating your teeth. Not in a good way. There's something endearingly rugged about it, though. Viking cuisine was straightforward. If it could be smoked, salted, or buried in the ground and dug up later, it probably counted as food. Tough grains, dried meats, dense barley breads baked directly on hot stones, all of it rough on the enamel, and none of it particularly hydrating. Mead, while delicious, is acidic and sugary. Not quite as cavity-inducing as modern soda, but still not ideal. And they drank it often, especially on feast days, of which there were many. Picture a long, torchlit hall, wooden mugs clanking together, warriors singing loudly, all while slow rot sets in below the gum line. And yet there's no dental panic, no rush to the medieval equivalent of a dentist who didn't really exist. Just an acceptance that teeth wear down. Fall out. That aching is a sign of age like gray hair or a limp from battle. Some researchers have even suggested that the Vikings didn't view tooth pain the way we do. Instead of immediately trying to fix it, they considered it part of life's endurance tests, like rowing upstream in sleet or sleeping on frozen ground. In Viking poetry, pain wasn't a problem, it was character development. That said, not everyone suffered equally. The rich chieftains, jarls, successful raiders likely had access to slightly better food and tools. Maybe finer grain bread. Maybe less grit. And if their mead was clearer, better filtered, their enamel might have thanked them quietly. Or not. We'll never know what it felt like to wake up with a molar so sore it made your ears ring. And just go on with your day. You shuffle past a table of cured sausages and dried berries, watching a young boy bite into what looks like a piece of tree bark. It's not punishment, it's a snack. Birch bark chewed like gum, partly for the taste, partly for the texture, and possibly unknowingly for the xylitol. Yes, some birch contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Unintended dental hygiene. Maybe. Historians still argue whether the Vikings knew this or just liked the crunch. One sagely-looking elder leans back, flashing a rare, nearly full set of teeth. They're dark at the edges, a little crooked but oddly well-spaced. No braces, no whitening strips. Just years of hearty meals and grit, literal and metaphorical. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, you imagine the wear of a single Viking lifetime. Chewing, gnashing, biting through everything from sinew to seal skin with no toothbrush. Waiting at night, only a toothpick tied to a belt or a bit of chewed root to spit out before sleep. So tonight, as you settle in with your own nightly rituals, floss, brush, maybe rinse with minty mouthwash. Take a moment to be grateful you weren't born with a longboat waiting and a mead horn as your hydration strategy. Because for all their strength and survival skills, the Vikings probably never experienced that particular joy of gliding your tongue across freshly brushed teeth. And yet they smiled. Broad, wild, fearless smiles. Yellowed, maybe, but real. The morning mist hangs low over the Viking camp, curling lazily between the turf-roofed longhouses. You duck inside one and immediately feel the warmth of the hearth. A woman elbows deep in a wooden tub is scrubbing something vigorously. It's not laundry. It's a set of tools, small, precise, and surprisingly elegant. Among them a bronze ear spoon, a miniature comb, and there it is, a delicately carved toothpick. This isn't a healer's kit or a warrior's belt pouch. It's a Viking grooming kit, and it's oddly sophisticated. Contrary to the lingering stereotype of wild, unwashed barbarians, Vikings were surprisingly invested in personal hygiene. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia, from burial mounds to settlement waste pits, have turned up dozens of these personal grooming tools. Tiny tweezers, shaped bone picks, even nail cleaners, all small enough to carry around and often made of bone antler or precious metal if you are someone important. You crouch beside the fire and pick one up. It's cool to the touch, smoothed by time. You can't help but imagine someone centuries ago crouching just like this, carefully cleaning their teeth before a feast or a raid. And while brushing, as we know, it wasn't quite a Viking habit, scraping and picking absolutely was. These weren't casual accessories. They were daily use items hung from belts or tucked into pouches. Because even when you're off to raid the Anglo-Saxons, you don't want roast lamb stuck in your incisors. Historians still debate whether these grooming tools were purely functional or carried social symbolism. Was a polished bronze toothpick the equivalent of today's luxury brand skincare? Some suggest it was a sign of status. I may have pillaged your village, but I keep my cuticles neat. You reach for another object in the kit, a slender curved implement that resembles a modern floss pick. Of course it isn't, but it shows how much thought went into bodily maintenance in Viking culture. It wasn't just for women either. Men groomed just as actively, especially warriors preparing for battle. A well-kept appearance was tied to honor, dignity, and control qualities deeply embedded in Norse values. And it wasn't only about cleanliness. There's a practicality to it too. A toothache in the middle of a voyage. You'd better believe that could mean the difference between a successful raid and a miserable, fevered mess on a cramped ship. You imagine yourself preparing for a long sea journey, kneeling in your longhouse by torchlight, packing your small bundle. Weapons check. Amulet of thought check. Toothpick carved from deer antler, still faintly scented with birch oil. Check. Yes, birch oil. There's some evidence that tree oils, especially from birch and juniper, were used for their antiseptic properties. You can almost smell it now. Crisp, sharp, slightly sweet. A breath-freshening routine, perhaps. Or a primitive attempt at numbing a sore gum. Historians still argue whether it was medicine or simply habit. You slip outside again, following the smoky scent of roasted meat. Near the communal fire, a burly man sits cross-legged, running a long sliver of metal along the edge of his teeth. Not digging, not panicking, just routine maintenance like oiling an axe. It's oddly calming to watch. In a world with no dental offices, no sedation, and no warning labels, a little proactive grooming probably saved a lot of pain. You glance around at the faces gathered near the fire, grizzled, weathered, but many still with teeth intact. Not pearly white, not perfect, but strong, maintained. Back in your own time, you might laugh at the idea of a Viking carrying tweezers. But here now, as the fire crackles and the wind rustles through thatched roofs, it makes perfect sense. Personal grooming isn't about vanity. It's about survival and comfort, and maybe looking good when you get to Valhalla. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the crackle of the Viking hearth follow you into sleep. And take comfort knowing that even in the harshest of environments, someone still made time to clean between their teeth. The sun breaks lazily through low clouds as you wander toward the training fields. A few young warriors are sparring with wooden axes, but one older man leans against a post, flashing a grin that stops you in your tracks. Not because it's warm or friendly, though it might be, but because his teeth are carved. Not chipped, not worn, but intentionally filed. Shallow horizontal grooves slice across the front, 2 incisors deep enough to cast tiny shadows in the morning light. You blink. He smiles wider. Decorative tooth filing among the Vikings isn't just some fringe theory. It's real. In 2009, archaeologists excavating a Viking burial site in Sweden discovered male skeletons with symmetrical horizontal grooves filed into their front teeth. No signs of trauma, no wear from chewing. These were deliberate modifications. Some were so precise they may have involved professional skill. Historians still argue whether these carvings were symbolic, aesthetic, or functional. Did they signal a warrior's status? Were they designed to intimidate enemies, or perhaps to identify clan membership like dental tattoos? There's no written Norse source that explains them, only the evidence etched into enamel centuries after the smiles faded. You take a few steps closer. The elder notices your interest, then pulls a smooth stone from his pouch and pretends to file one tooth, chuckling. Maybe he's teasing. Maybe it's a ritual. Maybe he just likes messing with foreigners. Either way, you start to see the Viking mouth not as a passive victim of diet, but a canvas. These weren't just people enduring the hardships of rotting molars, they were customizing themselves. Of course, this kind of filing isn't without risk. There's no indication they used any sort of antiseptic afterward, and plenty of chance for infection. If you've ever had a canker sore, imagine that, except it was self-inflicted with a stone tool and no ibuprofen in sight. Still, they did it. And not just once. The practice shows up in multiple remains across Scandinavia, and even some trading outposts further south. It might have spread with raiders, Or it might have been a sign of elite identity like Viking grills, but without the gold or the hip-hop swagger. And just imagine the first time someone did this. The hesitation, the pain, the blood, the courage or madness to look in a polished bronze mirror and say, yeah, that groove really completes the look. You glance over to the sparring field. Another young man flashes a smile, mid-duel, no carvings, just a single blackened tooth, probably from decay. Not all Vikings modified their teeth, but clearly some did. And the reactions must have varied awe, envy, discomfort. It's not like you could hide it. Every grin became a statement. Decorated teeth weren't unique to the Norse either. Across the world, cultures as far apart as the Mayans and pre-Columbian Filipinos filed or inlaid their teeth as markers of identity, beauty, or strength. So perhaps the Vikings were just part of a broader, more decorative dental tradition, one lost to time but never forgotten by the bones left behind. You think back to that first man on the ship smiling at you through fish breath and warrior pride. His grooves weren't a mistake. They were earned, etched, worn with confidence. Now you begin to notice the subtleties. In every Viking smile you pass a tooth missing here, a groove there, a faint chip likely earned from a stray elbow during a drunken feast. Each one tells a story, most never written, but permanently archived in enamel. And you walk through this village of dental survivors, feeling oddly connected, not by culture or conquest, but by teeth. That universal human struggle, the ache, the pride, the strangely intimate connection to what we chew, how we speak, and what we choose to display. So tonight, as you press your tongue to the back of your own teeth, appreciating their smooth, unfiled surface, let yourself be a little thankful. Not just for modern dental care, but for the silent, grooved smiles that once meant something profound to someone who never wrote it down. The chill rolls in from the shore, and you find yourself drifting toward a quieter edge of the settlement, somewhere between the smokehouse and the pen where a particularly unimpressed goat stares you down. There, beside a low fire, a cluster of elders sits huddled in wool cloaks, chewing slowly and talking even slower. You approach cautiously until one of them, without looking up, mutters something about sea wolf breath. It's not a compliment. The Vikings had many names for things, but fresh breath wasn't one of them. You settle in beside the group and soon realize their conversation isn't just gossip, it's an ongoing debate about who among them has the worst mouth. And by mouth, they mean smell. Friendly roast, sure. But underneath the chuckles is a shared truth. Viking halitosis was formidable. You breathe through your nose. Let's consider the causes. The Viking diet, rich in proteins and low in refined carbohydrates, didn't foster cavities the way modern Western diets do. But it also wasn't exactly breath mint friendly. Raw onions, garlic fermented fish, seal blubber, goat milk that had maybe turned just a bit, and of course mead-thick, sticky honeyed mead. Then there's the matter of oral bacteria. Without true toothbrushes or antiseptics, anaerobic bacteria had a field day in Viking mouths. Plaque buildup likely led to gum disease in older adults, and historians still argue whether gingivitis was simply ignored or treated with primitive rinses, perhaps salt water or even herbal brews made with mint yarrow or juniper. You glance at one elder who spits casually into the fire after working a fishbone picked between his molars. The hiss of it is oddly satisfying. What did Viking breath smell like? There are no written accounts for obvious reasons, but scientists who've studied dental tartar from Norse remains say that buildup was significant. And if you've ever smelled the inside of a fish market after a long summer day, you're halfway there. Interestingly, some Norse texts do hint at breath-related insults. A saga might call someone mouth-foul or mead-breathed, especially when the author wanted to insult not just the person's hygiene, but their moral character. Halitosis wasn't just unpleasant, it was untrustworthy. But don't be too quick to judge. These were people who lived hard lives in harsh climates. They sailed for weeks, slept on wet straw, and hunted whales with nothing but determination and a slightly warped harpoon. Expecting them to swish with peppermint oil is a bit much. Still, the Vikings weren't completely oblivious. Some oral care may have been spiritual. Certain runic charms were believed to ward off pain, including toothaches. One rune lagus associated with water was sometimes etched onto personal items for cleansing and healing. And while there's no rune for Listerine, the connection between ritual and remedy was real. As then, there's the case of chewing bones. Archaeological digs have uncovered flattened, worn tooth surfaces that suggest regular gnawing not on meat but on actual bone. Was it a nervous habit, left over from a rough meal, or an impromptu attempt at cleaning? Historians still debate. But it's easy to picture a Viking pacing outside a longhouse, chewing a rib like a dog with a dental toy. You hear a sudden laugh among the elders. One of them just confessed to kissing someone who hadn't rinsed since Yule. The others groan, but in that way that says we've all been there. You smile. Some things really don't change. You shift in your spot, the fire crackling low. Despite the funk, despite the bone chewing, you feel oddly at ease here. There's something comforting about the shared humanity of it all. You realize that in every generation, people have struggled with bad breath and tried to do something about it. Whether with mint leaves or mouthfuls of birch oil, we've all hoped for the same thing: to speak to, smiled to kiss, without knocking someone over. So tonight, as you breathe deeply into your pillow, know this: the Vikings may not have had fresh breath, but they had toothpicks, rituals, and jokes. And sometimes that's all you need. You wake before the sun fully rises, drawn by the quiet clink of metal against stone. A group of figures bundled in rough wool huddle around an excavation site just outside the village. Only this isn't a modern dig, this is a different kind of uncovering. And you somehow are both spectator and participant. You kneel down. The earth here is soft, recently turned. A few inches below the surface, nestled between fragments of pottery and shards of bone, lies something astonishingly ordinary, a tiny iron pick worn smooth at the tip. Nearby, a splintered piece of antler carved into a narrow point. You've just stumbled on Viking dental tools, and not ceremonial ones either. These weren't buried for magic or tribute. These were everyday items dropped, discarded, or perhaps buried with their owners out of practicality or respect. Toothpicks, picks, cleaners. They show up all across Viking Age archaeological sites in Gotland, Berka, even as far west as Dublin and York. You lift the metal one carefully. It's rusted but still recognizable, thin, with a small ring on one end, likely used to string it onto a cord. Imagine wearing your floss around your neck, announcing to the world that you're always ready to get spinach out of your teeth. If you had spinach or floss. Historians still argue whether these items were solely for teeth. Some suggest they doubled as earwax scrapers or nail cleaners, but the positioning of wear patterns and the consistent size points heavily toward oral use. Besides, Vikings didn't have a concept of single-use tools. One pick might clean your teeth, pluck a splinter, and stir your porridge if you were in a hurry. One particularly curious find in Denmark included a decorated grooming kit with both a pick and what might have been a tooth scraper, possibly bronze. It had delicate etchings on the handle, as if to say, just because I'm scraping molars doesn't mean I can't look good doing it. You imagine the kit's owner, a merchant, may be carefully packing it before a long voyage. Trade goods check. Sword check. Personal grooming. Absolutely. These tools weren't buried by accident. In fact, some Viking graves included grooming kits placed purposefully with the body, often alongside weapons or jewelry. It's possible that a clean mouth wasn't just a practical matter, but a part of one's identity, even in death. If you meet Odin, after all, you probably don't want sea-wolf breath. There's also the oddity of preservation. Metal survives, yes, but so does tartar. In fact, scientists have recently begun analyzing ancient dental calculus, essentially fossilized plaque, for clues to past diets, diseases, and behaviors. One Viking skeleton showed residue of milk proteins in the teeth, confirming they drank dairy. Another had microscopic traces of plants used medicinally, possibly for numbing pain. It's poetic, really. Centuries gone, yet the mouth still tells stories. You press your fingers into the soil and feel the gritty texture. Tiny particles of history waiting to be brushed aside. You wonder how many lives passed through this patch of ground, how many smiles, how many toothaches, how many moments of someone quietly picking something from between their teeth while thinking of a lost lover or a long sail or nothing at all. And suddenly, you understand something the Vikings didn't need toothbrushes to care about their mouths. They had tools, they had habits, they had a sense of ritual and in their own way of hygiene. A soft breeze moves the grass. You pocket the idea, not the artifact, and rise slowly, leaving the ancient tools where they belong. Someone long ago dropped them with care. Maybe they knew one day someone like you would find them and wonder. So tonight, as you brush your own teeth with a handle made of bamboo or plastic, consider the legacy beneath your fingertips. You're not just cleaning, you're continuing. Later that day, you find yourself in the shadow of a smoke-darkened long house where the smell of dried herbs lingers in the air, and a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands kneels beside a low table. This is no warrior's workshop, no blacksmith's forge. This is where pain comes to plead for relief. A makeshift healer's hut, and today, someone's come with a swollen jaw and a face twisted in agony. Toothache. The man moans as he kneels before the healer, clutching his cheek like it might fall off. The swelling is obvious, the tooth likely abscessed, and there is no Novocaine, no X-ray machine, no gentle humming from behind a sterile mask. Just a bone needle, a knife with a worn hilt, and a small bowl of something that smells like burnt pine. You crouch nearby, watching as she inspects the offending tooth with a thin iron pick. Her diagnosis is silent. The tooth has to go. Now you're not sure how much you want to witness this, but curiosity anchors you. What did dental care look like in the Viking Age, especially when things went wrong? The truth? It was brutal. There were no specialized dentists in Norse society, no one with a diploma at least. Instead, medical care fell to the Leknir healer, often a woman, occasionally a man, who handled everything from childbirth to battle wounds. And when it came to dental agony, their approach was practical. Remove the pain by removing the tooth. Historians still argue whether Vikings had any form of anesthesia. Some sagas mention herbal infusions that may have had numbing effects, perhaps made from willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin or henbane, a risky choice known to cause hallucinations, but nothing truly reliable. If you were lucky, you got mead. If you were luckier, you passed out early. The healer gestures for a helper to hold the man down. A dagger notched but sharp is warmed briefly in the fire. With a confident motion, she presses it to the gum not to slice but to loosen. Then comes the wooden wedge, wedged cruelly between teeth to isolate the offender. One pull, two. The man roars. Something cracks. The tooth comes free, bloodied and jagged. It falls into the bowl with a soft clink as if embarrassed to still be part of the story. You exhale, realizing you've been holding your breath. She presses a cloth of crushed yarrow and moss into the wound and binds the jaw with linen. A small rune, called the symbol of pain and ulcer, is etched onto a nearby charm, not to ward it off, but to acknowledge it. Pain was part of life. The charm might remind the man he'd endured it. It's easy to forget that even the fiercest warriors could be brought to their knees by a molar. No sword, no shield, just one angry nerve under the gum line. Still, there was some sense of care. The healer moves gently, offers the man a tincture afterward. He leans against the wall spent, but relieved, his breath shallow, now his mouth partly whole again. You look around the hut. Hanging from the beams are bundles of herbs, juniper, mugwort, maybe even clove. Their uses are speculative. Were they antiseptics, breath fresheners, placebo? No one knows for certain, but someone believed in them enough to dry and store them here. One corner of the room holds a collection of small bones, animal mostly shaped into implements. You recognize one from earlier, a fine pick stained at the tip. You think back to the grooming kits and wonder, were these tools hers? Passed down through generations or trophies from patients she helped? Historians still debate whether healers crafted their own tools or inherited them from other caretakers. You step back into the open air, shaken but grateful. Not just for modern medicine, but for the ancient courage it took to suffer in silence, to seek help without hope of numbness, and to face pain like it was a rite of passage. And as you run your tongue along your own unbroken row of teeth cool and clean, you remind yourself, even in a world of warriors, it was the healer with a steady hand who truly saved the day. You wander beyond the healer's hut, following a worn footpath that winds through a grove of crooked trees. The sky is darker now, clouded and heavy with the threat of rain. But your path is lit by the flickering glow of a small shrine up ahead. Nothing grand, just a circle of stones, a few carved runes, and the faint scent of herbs, burned not for cooking, but for comfort. This is where the Vikings whispered to their gods about things they didn't understand. And tonight, you're here to learn what they did when a toothache wasn't just physical, it was mystical. In Viking culture, illness wasn't always seen as a matter of the body. Often it was believed to stem from spirits' curses or imbalances of unseen forces. Tooth pain, for instance, might be blamed on toothworms, a concept that floated across ancient Europe and Asia for centuries. People believed tiny creatures burrowed into teeth, causing agony from within. There's no definitive record that Vikings believed this, but the myth shows up in Old Norse medicine texts from later centuries, blending superstition with early attempts at healing. Historians still argue whether the Norse fully subscribed to this idea or simply absorbed it through contact with neighboring cultures. But either way, you can imagine the scene: a man hunched beside this very shrine, clutching his jaw, offering a few coins or carvings to the gods in hopes of relief. Maybe he mutters a chant under his breath. Maybe he chews a sprig of mint, not because it helps, but because someone told him it might. Runes were often inscribed on small bones or bits of wood as talismans for health. One common charm was carved with a bind rune, an interweaving of symbols for strength, healing, and clarity. It might be tied around the neck or sewn into clothing, a silent plea for the ache to subside. In some cases, toothache remedies were chanted aloud. A 10th century charm from the Anglo-Saxon world, which the Vikings undoubtedly interacted with, describes a ritual where one recites a verse over the afflicted person's mouth, invoking divine forces to smite the pain. You can almost hear it now, softly spoken through chattering teeth. The ritual might go like this. First, the healer whispers the incantation. Then they chew a root, perhaps from angelica or wild ginger, and press it gently to the swelling gum. Not to cure exactly, but to symbolically draw out the pain. The logic is as much spiritual as it is botanical. Of course, whether it worked is another question entirely. You squat beside the stones and run your fingers over the damp surface. One rune, nearly worn away, likely once stood for Uruz, a symbol of physical strength and resilience. Another, shaped like a mirrored R, is Raido, a rune of travel. Maybe this was placed here by someone about to embark on a journey, hoping to rid themselves of a nagging molar before setting sail. The idea of spiritual cleansing before travel wasn't uncommon. You didn't want to anger the gods with your complaints, or worse, carry some cursed ache across the sea. Tooth pain then wasn't just a medical nuisance. It was an omen, a bad sign, a vulnerability you couldn't afford. In the sagas, you occasionally find references to characters being struck dumb or bitten by invisible knives. These could be metaphors for tooth pain, or evidence that even in epic tales of glory, dental distress had a role to play. Imagine facing your enemy with a pulsating abscess. Not very heroic. You sit for a while longer at the shrine, letting the soft rustle of the trees and the distant crackle of thunder lull you into stillness. Whether or not the runes ever truly worked, there's something deeply human in the attempt. In making a wish, a chant, a mark in the earth. In trying to control the one pain that sleep won't ignore. And as the wind picks up and your cloak pulls tighter around your shoulders, you take one last look at the shrine, silently thanking it for its quiet company. Tonight your teeth don't hurt, but if they did, you'd like to believe someone would carve a rune just for you. You leave the grove and make your way back toward the village, where the sky has dimmed into a soft slate gray. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and moss, and as you walk past a cluster of children playing with carved sticks and bits of twine, you spot an old woman seated on a stump, peeling long strips from a tree trunk with a curved blade. She doesn't look up when you approach, but she gestures toward the bark and says something that translates more or less to "for chewing." Good for the teeth. You glance down and realize this is birch, pale, flexible, and fibrous. It peels like paper, and in her weathered hands, it curls into clean, dry strips. She pops one into her mouth and begins to chew slow and rhythmic. You follow suit, hesitantly tearing a piece and tasting its bitter, slightly sweet edge. This is no snack, it's Viking chewing gum. Chewing birch bark may sound primitive, but it's quietly brilliant. Birch contains xylitol, a natural sugar alcohol that, according to modern science, actively combats the bacteria that cause cavities. Was this intentional? Probably not. Historians still argue whether Vikings understood the medicinal properties of birch or simply liked the taste and texture. But even accidental wisdom can leave a legacy. Archaeologists have found lumps of chewed birch tar, essentially hardened resin, in ancient Norse settlements, complete with tooth imprints. Some of these date back thousands of years. In some cases, DNA has been extracted from the saliva preserved inside, revealing not just who chewed them, but what they'd recently eaten. It's like a prehistoric chewing gum autopsy. You chew your strip in silence, mimicking the rhythm of the old woman. There's something meditative about it. Your jaw works gently, the taste lingers, and your mouth feels fresher, cleaner even. The fibers rub against your gums in a way that feels intentional, calming. You picture a Viking sailor tucked into the hull of a longboat chewing birch as the sea lurches around him. Not for fun, not for flavor, but for focus. Something to do with your mouth when food is scarce and thoughts are heavy. In the absence of toothbrushes and minty rinses, birch bark might have been the closest thing to oral hygiene available. No bristles, no paste, just nature used with quiet intention. Even more fascinating in some cases, chewed birch was used like glue. Once heated into tar, it became sticky enough to hold things together, arrows, wooden bowls, maybe even cracked teeth. Some remains have shown signs of dental repair using resin or pitch, though whether it worked or just prolonged the inevitable is up for debate. One Norse saga even mentions a man who chewed constantly as a way of coping with nerves before battle. Whether it was birch or something else isn't clear, but the act of chewing, repetitive and grounding, may have offered a small sense of control. You imagine Viking children being handed a strip of bark, just like a modern parent might hand over a pacifier or snack. Not a treat exactly, more like a habit, a tool, a moment of stillness in a loud and dangerous world. And then there's the symbolism. Birch trees were considered sacred in some Norse traditions, symbols of renewal, purity, and beginnings. So chewing birch might not have been just practical. It could have been ritual, a way to cleanse more than just your mouth. The old woman finishes her bark and hands you another. This one thinner, bit more curled. You accept it gratefully and chew in quiet companionship. The taste is different now, familiar somehow. Like you've done this before in another life, in another village beside another fire. And maybe you have. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you'll carry the memory of birch between your teeth, not as a relic of the past, but as a whisper of resilience, of how even the simplest things chewed, bark, quiet rituals can echo across centuries. As the stars begin to peek through the low clouds above the village, you drift toward the edge of the settlement where worn paths fork toward trading posts and ships tethered loosely to wooden stakes. The sound of soft conversation, creaking timber, and distant waves mix into a calming rhythm. You're drawn to a group of travelers who have just arrived, faces unfamiliar, garments foreign, but all of them welcome. Trade has always been a Viking specialty, and with trade came not just silver and spices, but ideas, including possibly better ways to deal with your teeth. These new arrivals speak in low tones and gesture animatedly over their wares, finely carved bone combs, small pouches of powdered herbs, metal toothpicks shaped like tiny arrows. You spot one man holding something odd, a strip of cloth wrapped around a thin stick. He rubs it across his teeth, not with force, but precision. It's brushing. Sort of. You step closer. He nods politely and offers you a small twig split at the end. It's a chew stick used in various parts of the ancient world, especially in places like Persia, North Africa, and parts of Asia. When frayed, the stick acts like bristles and often comes from antimicrobial plants like miswak. Historians still debate whether Vikings picked up this habit through contact with the Islamic world, maybe through trade routes running along the Volga or via interactions in Iberia. Either way, it's plausible. The Viking world was never isolated. From Baghdad to Byzantium, Norse merchants and warriors carried goods gold, and perhaps dental techniques. You take the stick and mimic the man's movements. It feels rough at first, but not unpleasant. The fibrous ends reach between your teeth, and the bitter taste isn't offensive, just earthy. Cleansing. You catch the eye of a nearby Viking woman who watches with a raised brow. She seems both skeptical and intrigued. You hand her the stick and shrug. Imported. Trade didn't just influence tools, it changed diets. Contact with the East brought in dried fruits like figs and dates, which were rare treats, but came at a price sugar. Not refined like today's candy, but sweet enough to stir up new dental problems. Suddenly, children and chieftains alike faced a novelty, the cavity. You overhear an elder grumble about soft teeth becoming more common. He blames foreign food. The old ways were best, he mutters, biting into something that looks suspiciously like rock-hard flatbread. Harder on the jaw, maybe, but safer for enamel. Alongside food came foreign remedies. Some travelers carried pouches of crushed clove, valued for its numbing effects, especially for toothaches. Others brought powdered charcoal used for polishing teeth or calming ulcers. A Roman technique perhaps echoing centuries beyond its empire. You find yourself wondering how many Viking warriors returned home, not just with loot, but with strange new habits. A different kind of toothpick, a fondness for dried apricots, a piece of cloth dipped in vinegar and salt rubbed over the teeth before sleep. One saga fragment even mentions a warrior whose tongue burned like pepper from the spices of the south. Not a dental reference exactly, but proof that global flavors and their consequences made it into Norse lives. As the traders settle down for the night, you watch one tie a tiny bundle of herbs to his belt, tucked beside his blade. Lavender, maybe, or something sharper. He whispers a short verse, perhaps protection, perhaps thanks, and leans back on a fur cloak, chewing the end of a licorice root. You realize again how much is shared between people even across seas. We all eat, we all chew, we all wince when a molar goes rogue. And so, nestled under a quiet sky, surrounded by strangers and their customs, you smile softly to yourself. Your teeth may not be perfect, but they've traveled far tonight. Dawn arrives like a whisper, not a roar. Pale light drips over the rooftops of the village as you wander toward the burial mounds on the hill. It's quiet here. No clanking of shields, no trading chatter, just the rustle of wind through long grass and the soft creak of ancient wood settling into soil. You're not here to mourn. You're here to look at teeth. Somewhere beneath these mounds lie generations of Vikings warriors, weavers, raiders, dreamers. And in recent years, archaeologists have exhumed their secrets. Among swords and brooches and coins, one detail often stands out: jawbones, still mostly intact, teeth still rooted in place. Not pristine, but telling. You picture a burial you once read about: an elderly man interred with a sword on one side and a comb on the other. A warrior, yes, but also a groomed man. His teeth, worn almost flat, showed signs of years of hard chewing, likely from grain-heavy bread laced with tiny stones and from countless bites into tough, dried meats. More fascinating still, in some graves, teeth appear intentionally displayed. Skulls tilted upward, jaws parted as if to show off the final smile. In rare cases, decorative grooves in the front teeth are still visible even after centuries in the ground. It's a quiet declaration this was a man of status, or fear, or both. Historians still argue whether these grave displays were intentional or simply the result of how bodies settled with time. But the idea persists that even in death, Vikings may have wanted their teeth to say something. You walk further to a smaller, less adorned mound, a woman's grave. The bones here suggest she was a merchant, or perhaps a high-ranking matron. Beside her are beads, combs, and a slender hooked implement made of silver, likely a toothpick, beautifully crafted. She might have been the healer, or simply someone who cared deeply for appearances. The item was found near her jaw, not her waist. That detail matters. It suggests regular use, not just decoration. Perhaps she cleaned her teeth after meals, before prayers, before bed. A quiet ritual, a moment of control in a world where storms could take everything. Even more curious are the children's graves. Tiny skeletons, worn enamel. Evidence of milk teeth gone too soon. In some, dental decay is surprisingly advanced, likely due to increased access to honey or fruit. It's a bittersweet reminder that trade brought treats and consequences. In one grave, a child no older than 6 is buried with a tiny carved bear and a leather pouch. Inside the pouch, a thin sliver of wood sharpened at one end. Maybe a toy, maybe a tool, maybe both. Maybe they chewed it after meals, or when frightened, or because they'd seen their parents do it. You crouch at the edge of the mound, your hand brushing over the soil. Even now, so many generations later, the evidence remains. Dental wear patterns, microscopic scratches, jaw misalignment from early tooth loss. It's all their pain adaptation. Survival. But these weren't people defeated by their teeth. They lived, chewed, spoke, and smiled, despite the pain, despite the rot, despite the tools that could never numb. You picture them laughing, feasting, debating which herbs made the best rinse or who had the worst breath after a week at sea. It wasn't vanity, it was human. Tonight, as you lie down in your own quiet space, your teeth brushed and flossed and comfortably unfiled, think of the jaws resting beneath the earth. Not with dread, but with respect. They bit through a life far harder than ours, and they're still telling stories. You leave the hillside graves behind and make your way back into the village, where laughter is echoing from the central hall. It's feast day, apparently, an occasion not marked by a calendar, but by instinct. The smell of roasting meat, the sound of lyre strings, and the unmistakable pop of dried fruit being dropped into porridge signal that tonight even the gods are invited. Inside the longhouse, benches creak under the weight of villagers in various stages of celebration. Children run between legs, cheeks sticky with honey. You take a seat near the hearth, where a woman is carving something into a wooden ladle. When she glances up and smiles, her teeth flash bright, and then you see it. One front tooth slightly darker than the rest. A cavity, or the remains of one. Even in the Viking age, sugar had consequences. Viking children didn't drink soda or chew candy, but they did have access to natural sugars. Dried berries, fermented fruits, and most famously, honey. While rare and precious honey was both food and medicine used in rituals and meals alike. And as trade routes expanded, so did access to sweeter treats, dates, figs, even candied nuts from far-off lands. Historians still argue whether Viking children developed cavities at higher rates due to these delicacies, or whether other factors like shorter jawbones from malnutrition led to dental crowding and decay. Either way, the results are visible in excavated remains. Small skulls, tiny molars, and all too tiny holes. You sip something warm from a carved horn, watching a boy gnaw contentedly on a sticky lump of dried apple. A few women tease him, pointing at his molars and laughing. He bares his teeth proudly, showing a gap. Lost to age or sugar? Hard to say. The Norse sagas rarely mention children's dental woes, likely because they had bigger concerns, but you have to imagine the experience wasn't so different from today. A sore tooth, a restless night, a parent rubbing crushed herbs on the gum while whispering a lullaby. A child squirming, tears drying into sleep. One burial in Denmark included a child laid to rest with beads a toy, and unusually a birch chewing stick, perhaps a comfort item, or maybe a last-ditch remedy that came too late. It's one of those tender, silent details archaeology sometimes leaves behind. A story with no words, only context. You look around the hall and realize that children here are not babied, but they're not neglected either. They're taught early how to cook, how to carve, how to clean their own teeth, even if that means scraping with a fishbone or rinsing with cold river water. Habits passed down through generations, half folklore, half function. In one corner of the room, a mother chews birch bark, softening it before handing it to her daughter. The girl bites it carefully, mimicking the rhythm. It's a quiet moment, easily lost in the noise of the feast, but it speaks volumes. Hygiene here isn't separate from life. It's part of it. You wonder if Viking children ever got scolded for skipping their nightly scrape. Or if they were warned, keep that up and you'll end up at the healers with a knife in your gums. Maybe that was enough. Modern parenting books rarely include advice on how to floss with antler picks or soothe toothache spirits with rune chants. But here in this flickering hall of mead and stories and crumb-filled beards, you begin to appreciate the ingenuity, the resourcefulness, the care wrapped in bark and laughter. So tonight, when you tuck yourself in and feel the clean line of your own teeth behind your lips, spare a thought for those Viking kids who chewed bark and braved winter without fluoride, but still found a way to smile. They did their best with what they had. And maybe that's enough. The fire in the longhouse burns lower now, casting soft gold on the timbered walls. You lean back against a fur-lined bench full from porridge and warm mead, listening to the quiet murmur of stories unraveling near the hearth. A man with a long silver-streaked beard begins to recite, voice low and gravelly, the kind that doesn't hurry because it knows people will listen. He's telling a saga, not one of gods or dragons, but of a fisherman who bit into a frozen eel and broke his tooth clean in half. The crowd chuckles and you smile. Apparently, Viking storytelling didn't shy away from the mundane or the painful. In these sagas, amid the battles and betrayals, toothaches sometimes make surprise appearances. They're not the stars of the show, but they pop up comic relief symbols of fate, or just another reminder that even heroes have molars. One tale describes a warrior so fearsome his enemies claimed even his teeth howled in the cold. Another mentions a woman who won a wager by biting through a silver coin, only to regret it the next day. You can't help but laugh quietly. Some things never change. Historians still debate how much of the saga dental content is exaggeration versus observation. The Norse were oral historians, after all, literate in memory, if not in ink. Exaggeration was part of the art, but it's hard to invent the specific misery of biting something hard and feeling that sudden, searing zap into your jaw. Someone had lived it. The sagas are also where teeth become symbols. Odin, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, is said to have whispered runes into the mouths of warriors before battle. In some interpretations, this gesture granted not just power, but clarity, perhaps even a cure for ailments of the mouth. Or more practically, the encouragement to grit your teeth and keep going. In a different tale, a Jarl consults a vulva, a Norse seeress, about a strange pain in his mouth that won't go away. She doesn't suggest herbs or charms. Instead, she tells him it's the voice of his dead brother stuck behind his teeth. Symbolic, sure, but also oddly dental. You can't help but wonder if even mysticism had roots in toothache. You shift your gaze to a small boy, listening wide-eyed nearby mouth, half open in awe. His teeth are uneven, a few missing. He pokes at a gap with his tongue, then catches you watching and grins. You give him a slow nod, the international sign of hang in there, it gets better. Tooth pain in the Viking world wasn't just medical or magical. It was story. Something you joked about, lamented, maybe even made peace with. If it ached long enough, it earned a place in the tale. You think back to that fisherman and his frozen eel, how he probably spent the next 3 days sipping thin broth and mumbling curses. Maybe his wife told him, you should have chewed with the other side. Maybe the eel got away. Maybe it didn't matter because the story is what lived on. And isn't that the real balm? Not the herbs or the fishbone picks or the chanting under moonlight, but the knowledge that pain becomes a story. And stories soothe even when they sting a little first. As the silver-bearded man finishes, the room falls into a contemplative hush. A few murmurs, a few satisfied sighs. You lean back, tracing your tongue along your own unbroken teeth, thinking of the countless sagas buried in every skull that ever winced mid-bite. So tonight, as you drift off, remember this. Even the gods had teeth. And when they hurt, they probably told someone about it. Outside, the wind has quieted, and the moon casts a soft silver glow over the village roofs. You step out into the night, your breath curling in the cold air. There's peace now, the kind that settles in after bellies are full and stories have been told. You stroll slowly past the sleeping longhouse and down toward a row of small homes nestled along the water, thinking not of gods or warriors, but of toothbrushes, or rather the myth of Viking filth. For centuries, the common image of a Viking was a snarling, muddy brute beard caked with grime teeth like broken tombstones. Hygiene somewhere between none and accidental, but the truth far more nuanced, maybe even cleaner. Historians and archaeologists have gradually uncovered a very different reality. Vikings, for the most part, cared about how they looked. They combed their hair, bathed regularly, usually once a week, which was impressive for the era. and yes, clean their teeth. A 10th century Arabic traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan once described the Norsemen he encountered along the Volga as both fearsome and obsessive about grooming. He noted with a hint of judgment how they combed their hair, washed their faces, and most notably cleaned between their teeth with wooden picks. Often, this account is one of the earliest written records we have of Viking hygiene, and it clashes wildly with the idea of the unwashed berserker. Toothpicks weren't just for decoration, they were part of a daily routine. Simple, quiet, but consistent. And not just men either. Women too kept grooming kits sometimes more elaborate than their male counterparts. The few surviving examples show remarkable craftsmanship: small mirrors, slender metal picks, even ornate containers for holding herbs or fragrant oils. Vanity may be, but also practicality. Rotten teeth don't care about gender. You stop near a rain barrel and lean in, catching a glimpse of your reflection. The shimmer is faint, distorted, but enough. You try to imagine what you'd look like through Viking eyes. Probably too soft, too pink, too unscarred. But your teeth, maybe not so different. You think of all the little efforts, the scraping, the chewing, the rinsing with cold river water. It wasn't oral surgery, but it was a system, a lifestyle. A belief that how you carried yourself mattered, even if your molars hurt, even if your gums bled. You still tried. Historians still debate whether Vikings scented their toothpicks with herbs like juniper or birch sap, or if that's a romanticized detail. But the very idea is charming. Imagine a world where you flavor your grooming tools, not with chemicals, but with the forest. And then there's the deeper truth. Hygiene was not just about health. It was about identity. Cleanliness marked civilization. It marked strength. Vikings didn't want to look like savages. They wanted to be respected and feared and remembered. You pass by a shuttered stall where a merchant's display from earlier still lies on the table, small grooming tools polished and lined up neatly. One has a carving of a wolf, another of a spiraled rune. Functional, beautiful. You realize, not for the first time, that you've been wrong about these people, or maybe just incomplete. They weren't trying to survive despite their environment. They were surviving with it, birch bark, bronze picks and all. So tonight, as you curl beneath your own blanket, let go of the old myths. Let them fade into mist like breath in the cold. The Vikings weren't perfect, but they were deliberate. And if someone ever calls you a barbarian for flossing twice a day, just smile. The Norse would have approved. You return to the shoreline one last time, where the tide has receded, leaving behind wet sand and a few scattered shells. The village is quiet now, fires down to embers, laughter faded into memory. It's the hour before sleep fully settles, when the air feels thick with everything left unsaid. You sit on a stone worn smooth by centuries of use and look out across the water, thinking not of warships or gods or heroic deaths, but of molars, of methods of mouths that came before. It's strange, isn't it? The more you've wandered through this Viking world, the more you realize how much of their legacy was lived not in battlefields, but in habits. A toothpick tucked into a belt. A child chewing birch bark without knowing why. A woman warming oil before rinsing her mouth. Quiet choices practiced again and again until they became culture. And now, here you are, centuries later, turning over fragments of that culture like sea glass in your hand. You recall the healer's firm grip, the trader's minty stick, the runes etched for pain, the jawbones displayed with pride. All of it points to the same unspoken truth, even in an age ruled by iron and ice. Oral care mattered. Maybe not in the way we think of it today. No fluoride, no ceramic crowns, but in a deeper way. A practical reverence, a resilient ritual. Historians still argue whether Viking dental practices were effective. Some say their teeth survived due to diet alone. Others point to the archaeological evidence, tools, wear patterns, resins that suggest a more intentional form of care. But no matter where the academic pendulum swings, one thing is clear: they paid attention. They endured. And if you look closely at modern trends, charcoal toothpaste, natural bristles, oil pulling, you'll find echoes of them. Proof that the old ways never truly leave us. They just shift like the tide. A raven glides overhead, its wings slicing silently through the moonlight. You wonder what it's seen. Maybe it remembers. Maybe it's just looking for snacks. In the distance, you hear the faint creak of a dock rope, the gentle groan of a boat shifting with the water. Someone somewhere is still awake, scraping the last bit of food from their teeth with a carved stick. A bedtime routine older than recorded time. You brush your fingers against your own jaw, suddenly aware of the smooth curve of your teeth beneath your skin. How much we take them for granted. How many stories they hold. So tonight, as you close your eyes and slip into rest, you carry the quiet legacy of Viking tooth care with you. Not glamorous, not glorified, but strangely beautiful in its persistence. They didn't have dentists. They had discipline. They had discomfort. They had dignity. And they smiled anyway. So now, with the fire long since faded and the village asleep under a blanket of stars, you lie back and let your breath deepen. Each inhale slower than the last. Each exhale a little heavier. The voices have quieted the clinking tools, packed away the stories finished for tonight. You're no longer in the longhouse, not even by the fjord. You're floating somewhere in between centuries, between cultures, between waking and sleep. Let the images drift now like slow-turning pages in a book you don't need to finish. A birch stick half chewed, a silver pick warm from a hand that once held it every evening, the soft rasp of a tooth being cleaned beside a smoky fire. It's not sharp or jarring. It's gentle, intentional, almost loving. There's peace in these small rituals, in knowing that even the toughest among us still cared for their bodies in quiet, almost tender ways. Let that thought ease your mind. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders soften. You've traveled far tonight, not by ship, but by memory. And now, like those warriors after their last feast, you can finally rest. Your teeth are safe. Your story is whole. And sleep is already here.